Well, I can't possibly get through all my slides in 15 minutes, so I'll post them on my website, which is ellenbrown.com, and I'll do my best. But even though there's not enough time, I do want to take a little time to tell a story since we're doing storytelling. This is actually an email I got from someone who was a grandfather, and he said he was playing Monopoly with his granddaughter, his 5-year-old granddaughter. And we know Monopoly was a game created to show that in our current system, the rich get richer until they have everything. So he was getting kind of bored with the game, and she had all the chips. And he said, well, I'm out. I don't have any chips. I can't play anymore. And so she, this 5-year-old, gave him half her chips. So the point is that even a 5-year-old knows that if you want to keep the game going, you've got to share your chips. But that is not the system we have today. So what we have is something that looks like this, where you have, this is the disparity between rich and poor. So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer until it's unsustainable, the thing collapses, and then it happens again, the rich get. So we have bubbles and busts, booms and busts. The peak on the left is 1929, and then there was a collapse, and then we went along for it with a period of stability for a while, and then there was another peak over here on the right, that's 2008, which collapsed, but it didn't collapse to the extent that it did in 1929 because we had a new system where the government, meaning we the taxpayers, bailed out the culprits who were the too big to fail banks. So again, we have this widening disparity. I'm not sure what, oh there, okay. So Alan Greenspan admitted that there was a flaw in his theory, and what he said the flaw was that markets do not self-correct. In other words, that you need some regulation. If you let markets go by themselves, you'll get a chart like what we just saw. But I would say that the real flaw is something more fundamental, which is that in our system, banks themselves are allowed to and do create virtually all of our money supply, and they lend it back to us at interest. You can tell that from this chart of the money supply, which the top line is M2, which is the circulating money supply. The only money created by the government, which is where most people think money comes from, is about halfway up the red line. That's coins and dollar bills, and that's even assuming that the Federal Reserve, which issues dollar bills, is part of the government, which I would argue it isn't, since it's composed of 12 branches, all of which are 100% owned by the private banks in their district. But anyway, and then this chart doesn't even include M3, which is the shadow banking system, derivatives, et cetera. So there's a huge money system out there that is not created by the government. Money reformers have been saying for years that money is created by banks, but the Bank of England just admitted that a year ago in a directive where they said, banks do not act simply as intermediaries, lending out deposits that savers place with them, and nor do they multiply up central bank money to create new loans and deposits. Commercial banks create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. So money is created in the process of making a loan. And you might say, well, then why do they need our deposits? They obviously do. They're always trying to get them. The reason is that they have to balance their books at the end of the day. So there's a reserve requirement, let's say 10%. I mean, it varies a bit, but they have to keep a certain amount in a reserve account with the Federal Reserve. And at the end of the day, they have checks and money coming in and going out all day. And at the end of the day, if they don't have that 10% in the reserve account, the Federal Reserve treats it as an automatic overdraft, and then they have to come up with the money somehow. So the cheapest place they can get that money is to borrow from their own depositors, and they borrow at, well, Chase Bank right now is paying 0.1%, and that's on, I think that's on time deposits. So that means if you leave $1,000 in the bank for a year, they will pay you $1. So they are getting this money very cheaply, or they can get it from the money market at 0.15%, or from other banks at the Fed funds rate of 0.25%, or from the Federal Reserve itself, the lender of last resort, at 0.75%. If they get it from other banks, the Fed funds rate, basically here's what's happened. Bank A, let's say you go to your bank and you take out a mortgage. You want $500,000 to pay for your new house. And so they will monetize your mortgage, essentially, turning your mortgage into a negotiable instrument, put that on one side of their books as an asset to themselves, and then put it on the other side of the books as a liability to themselves because they have to cover that $500,000 check when it goes out of the bank. So it goes into Bank B. Bank B now has $500,000 in excess deposits. Bank A is $500,000 short. So Bank A borrows from Bank B at 0.25%. So essentially, they've created the money. It's a check-kiting scheme. They've created the money. It goes into another bank. They borrow it back. So they borrow it back extremely cheaply, and they lend it to you at 5%, or if it could be a business loan at 8%. It could be credit cards at 16%. So they're making the difference between that very low rate that they paid for the money and what you're going to pay on it. So over the course of like 30 years on a mortgage, you're going to pay at least twice so you're going to pay $1 million back on that mortgage. And over the course of a 30-year bond issue, the government, local governments will pay double. So they're paying 50% of what local governments pay for infrastructure goes to interest. So the way we can recapture that interest is to own the bank. But this is what we have today, where does that interest come from? Because virtually all money is created by banks when they make loans. It can only come from somebody else taking out another loan at interest. So you have this voracious sort of more and more debt supporting the lenders at the top until the whole thing collapses, which would actually work if the interests were going back into the system. If it were a government, the government would spend that money on roads and bridges and the things that people need, and that could be used in the payment of interest, wages, et cetera, and then that could come back in the payment of loans. But that's not the system we have today. Today, the interest goes to shareholders or wealthy executives, or if it's part of the capital structure of the bank, it will go into more loans, which will be yet more loans at interest. So it's this sort of parasitic drain on the economy, always sucking more out than goes in. So inevitably, what you have is a debt overhang, because debt always grows faster than the real economy. So the real economy grows arithmetically in a straight line. That's goods and services. And then you've got this financial thing, this exponential function that only can happen in math, or in nature it can happen also in parasites and cancers. And what happens is that the parasite eats up its food source, and when the food runs out, then the whole thing collapses. And that's where we are. That's where it looks like we are now, and it certainly was where we were in 1929 and 2008. So how can we get around all that? Own the bank. This was a model that was actually first developed by the Pennsylvania colonists in Benjamin Franklin's time. So the colonists at that time had come up with this great system where they were issuing paper scrip. They didn't have to borrow from the Bank of England, which we now know was just issuing paper themselves. They didn't have to borrow from the goldsmiths. They just issued paper and spent it into the economy. But the trouble was, it was a lot easier to issue and spend than to pull it back. It was supposed to be an advance against taxes, but it was pretty hard to get taxes out of these frontiersmen, back in the wild colonial days. So they wound up inflating the system and deflating the value of the currency. But in Pennsylvania, they came up with a system where most of the money was being lent into the system. So they owned a bank, a publicly owned bank called the Land Bank. I just made up these figures myself, but just say theoretically that you issued $105. You're the creator of money. You issue $105. You lend $100 at 5% to the farmers. then you spend the $5 into the economy, roads and bridges and things that people need. So now you have $105 out there, which all comes back as principal and interest, or it's available anyway. Then you can lend the 100 all over again, spend the 5 all over again, it all comes back as principal and interest. So you can do that over and over without hyperinflating the system. And in fact, during the period that that system was in place, the colonists did not pay taxes, the prices did not inflate, and they had no government debt. So it was a totally sustainable system, and we could have that today. In the U.S., we actually have one such bank. I mean, not that it's the Bank of North Dakota, not that they can issue paper scrip like the colonists could, but they can create money. As we know, all banks create money in the form of advancing credit. And so the Bank of North Dakota does that for the benefit of the people. It was set up in 1919 when the North Dakota farmers were losing their farms to the Wall Street bankers, and they wanted to keep their money in the state to be leveraged for their own purposes. So that's what they did. North Dakota currently has the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the lowest default rate on credit card debt, one of the lowest foreclosure rates, and they were the only state that completely escaped the credit crisis. Like, they never went in the red. But then people would say, well, North Dakota has oil, that's the reason they're doing so well. And so it was actually in response to that argument. I started writing about this back in 2008, after the 2008 crisis. And but that would be the response. Well, North Dakota has oil, and that's why they're doing so well. So I looked globally and historically at other public banking models, and that was why I wrote a follow-up book, The Public Bank Solution. It turns out, to my own surprise, 40% of banks globally are publicly owned. They're largely in the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which house 40% of the global population, and which also escaped the credit crisis, at least initially. I mean, every country's been dragged down by now. Okay. So I pretty much, I've got 2 minutes left, but I'm going to post this on my website, and all this stuff is in my books, which are actually on sale downstairs. But I'll do what I can here. Yeah. Okay, so the Bank of North Dakota model is that by law, all of the state's deposits are deposited into the bank, the state's own bank. It's set up as a DBA of the state, so it's set up as North Dakota doing business as the Bank of North Dakota. So technically, they have a huge capital base, and they have a huge deposit base. So then they leverage that money, as all banks do, as Wall Street is doing with our money, with most states' money. They leverage that into more loans for their own purposes. They've returned, on average, $40 million annually to the state for the last number of years, and which may not sound like a lot, but they're a state that's only about 50% larger than Portland. So it's a very small state. So that's a very nice return from so it's a big moneymaker for the state. They have a return on equity of 20%. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal last November stating that the Bank of North Dakota actually is more profitable than JP Morgan Chase and other Wall Street banks. And this is because they have very low costs. They don't have to advertise for depositors. They don't have to advertise for borrowers. What they do is they partner with the local banks. So the local bank acts as the front office, and the Bank of North Dakota is sort of a wholesale bank that just helps with capital and helps with liquidity. So they allow the small local banks to make loans that they couldn't otherwise make. They allowed them to escape the whole subprime crisis because they didn't have to sell their loans off to investors. And they don't have high-paid CEOs. They don't have shareholders. Their highest-paid CEO is, or their highest-paid person is the president, who makes about $240,000 a year, compared to $20 million for Wells Fargo. They don't do derivatives, et cetera. Done. Okay, so you can escape the credit crisis. You can actually leverage your money so that you can make money instantly, and the state or the city or the county could do this, make money overnight in ways that I have explained. I guess I gotta quit. So thank you very much.
So, my mission to you is to talk about what an alternative financial world would look like. And I've titled the talk, The End of Wall Street and the Coming Local Investment Revolution. And I come to bring you good news and bad news. The good news is we are winning. On the argument about what are the best kinds of business for economic development, the best kinds of business for resilience, businesses that are competitive, the evidence is absolutely clear that locally owned businesses and local self-reliance is exactly the ticket for prosperity in this country. And I want to give you a sense of how important this argument really is. Because when you break down the jobs in the U.S. economy, and this chart sort of does that, apologies to my colleagues here who can't have to imagine this, but the top line, the black line, is the percentage of people who are self-employed. So that's about 12, 13%. Then there are businesses with under 100 jobs in it. Then there's that blue stripe of 100 to 500 jobs, which according to the Small Business Administration is officially a small business. And then the red stripe is sort of big business. Now here's the thing. We know that 99.9% of the firms in those first top three stripes are locally owned businesses. In other words, more than half the economy is locally owned business. The other thing is look at the share of jobs. If it were true that local businesses during this era of globalization were becoming less competitive, we would have seen jobs move from the local half of the economy to the non-local half of the economy. And yet you can see there's been almost no change whatsoever. And what's really remarkable about this is that all of the subsidies have been for the non-local business. All of the economic development subsidies, all the cattle, all the food subsidies, all the energy subsidies. It's remarkable that local businesses have done this well despite the best efforts of public policy to kill them. Imagine if we had gotten public policy half right. We would actually have seen jobs move into the local half of the economy. What about profitability? Well, we know from the latest data available from the United States that sole proprietorships, which most small businesses either are or start out as, are 11 times as profitable as C corporations, with partnerships falling somewhat in between. Now, if you want a more rigorous analysis of profitability, they do this in Canada. And it turns out that the most profitable Canadian companies, according to their most recent data, have 10 to 20 employees. And the profit rates of those businesses are 60% higher than those that are traded on the Canadian Stock Exchange. So all of this good news, local businesses are great for the economy. We love them. That's why we're here. We're spreading this worldwide. They occupy, a tremendous niche within the economy. They're competitive. They're profitable. So surely all of you are putting your money into them. So let's do a quick survey. By show of hands, how many people here have mindfully bought something locally over the last week? Okay, almost everyone's hand has gone up. How many people here do their banking at a local bank or credit union? Almost all the hands, that's great. Those of you who didn't put up your hand, we're going to have a little word after this presentation. How many of you with pension funds have 1% of those funds in locally owned business or more? Okay, I see a couple of half-hearted hands. You may be right, you may not be, but this is outrageous. This is outrageous. You are the most locavore people in one of the most locavore states in the country, and yet you folks here in an economics of happiness conference are systematically overinvesting in the Fortune 500 companies you've been denouncing for the last 24 hours and underinvesting, not putting any money into the local businesses you've been glorifying. Something is wrong with this picture. And what's wrong with this picture is this guy. We have a system of laws in this country enacted in the early Jurassic period called securities law. And in those laws, we created a system of investor apartheid. If you are in the top 1% of income earners or wealth holders, you are allowed to invest in anything, anytime, no questions asked. If you're in the other 99%, you may only put a penny into a locally owned business if that business has done a massive pile of securities law disclosures that could easily cost $25,000, $50,000, or $100,000. And at the end of those disclosures, you get a thick booklet, 100 pages, tiny font, some of it's written in all caps. No human being has ever been observed to read this book. And yet, this is the ticket to avoid jail to do a local offering. So almost no company does it. What would happen if we changed the rules? Okay, so it turns out that Americans have $30 trillion of long-term savings in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, pension funds, and insurance funds. If we had an effective capital system, roughly speaking, half of that money, $15 trillion, would go into the half of the economy that is locally owned. And now, almost nothing does. If we were to fix this, there would be a $15 trillion shift from Wall Street to Main Street, which, by the way, works out to, what do I have up there? $186 billion coming to Oregonians. By a show of hands, could anyone use $186 billion for their projects here? Okay, good. So how do we end the free ride from Wall Street? I really puzzled a lot about this. And in 2009, I wrote a piece for the Federal Reserve that tried to look at the basic assumptions of securities law. One of the basic assumptions is we don't want people to be defrauded. And the way that it's often expressed is we don't want grandma to buy swampland in Florida. Now, my mother, 92, living in Missouri, I don't want her to buy swampland in Florida. So, yeah, there is a good rationale for some of the securities law. But here's the thing. When I visited my mother for her 92nd birthday last week, we did our favorite pastime, which is we went to the local casino. And when my mother entered the local casino, did they say, "Excuse me, Mrs. Shuman, but are you an accredited gambler?" And no, that question never gets asked. Or did they say, "Before you sit down and play blackjack, will you read this thick disclosure statement on all the risks of playing blackjack and sign?" No, that didn't happen. So we have two systems of risk management in this country. One system of risk management says, if you're gambling, come on in, lose it all. We don't care what your income is. The other system says if you care about saving your local economy and creating jobs and prosperity, you can't play unless you pay off a lawyer $25,000 for a useless disclosure document. Something is fundamentally wrong with this picture. So I proposed in this article a $100 exemption. The idea being that $100 was no more risky than a dinner for two at a new restaurant, okay? And, new restaurants don't have to do $25,000 of disclosure work before they serve their first meal. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a lot of new restaurants. So an amazing thing happened. Janelle and some of her colleagues filed a rulemaking petition with the Securities and Exchange Commission around the $100 exemption. Hundreds of letters poured into the SEC. And what happened? Nothing. This woman, then the head of the SEC, was testifying on Capitol Hill, Mary Shapiro, in 2011. And she was asked by a Tea Party Republican whatever became of the $100 exemption proposal. And she, dripping with condescension, said, well, you know, we get these ridiculous proposals for reform all the time. Maybe we'll put a committee together to look at this and other crowdfunding reforms. The committee went ballistic because everyone on that committee knew that small businesses are the only place where we're getting new jobs. And unemployment at this point was 9%. She was basically saying, we don't care at the SEC about solving unemployment. That committee voted unanimously, not for a $100 exemption, but for a $10,000 exemption. This then went, with a little bit of further discussion, to the Senate, where it got whittled back to $2,000 and requirements like you have to go to a community portal. And then President Obama signed the Jobs Act in April of 2012. And I was sitting in the audience taking that picture, my only trip to the White House. And I have to say, you know, like many of you, I have spent my lifetime affiliated with losing causes. To finally have one that won was just, like, shocking. So we thought this was great, and rules were supposed to be implemented by the SEC in, I don't know, I think it was December of 2012. Well, what has happened is that the SEC now has a million excuses why they can't complete the rules on this. We're more than 2 years beyond the signing. And I guess it's almost 3 years at this point, and nothing has happened. It might happen, but who knows? The SEC is trying to kill it through inaction. Now, that could be the bad news, except here is the good news. Around the country, people at the state level have said, you know what? We are not waiting for the SEC. We are going to liberalize the securities laws within our state. And one of the states most recently that liberalized this is Oregon. You folks now have a clear pathway to help local businesses raise up to $250,000 in debt or equity from Oregonians, and every Oregonian is allowed to put in up to $2,500 per year. And if you go to hatchoregon.com, you can invest in these companies. And if you're a company, you can get yourself listed here, not for $25,000, but for a lot cheaper. But not only that, in my state of Maryland, something remarkable happened. A woman called me about a year ago and said, I really like that $100 proposal of yours. Why don't we try to implement that? And I said, you know, good luck. Don't have a lot of time. And 6 months later, she called and asked if I would testify on this before the House and the Senate in Maryland. She single-handedly, a grad student in economics, got the $100 exemption law passed in Maryland unanimously in both houses, signed into law by Governor O'Malley. And there are other reformers. Michael Savant, getting a local stock exchange passed in Michigan over the past year. So, yesterday we talked a little bit about Nova Scotia has 15 years of creating local investment funds. And I mentioned last night that if we had as many local investment funds in the United States per capita, we would have 21,000 of these funds in the United States. There is a huge revolution that is occurring. And I believe the dam of investment apartheid is bursting. We can make it happen at the grassroots here. we can spread it internationally, and our goal is not to occupy Wall Street, but to end it.
In 2010, a trio of researchers from the University of British Columbia published a paper that challenged the way the social sciences have for a century made really broad generalizations about human nature and behavior based on research that is solely conducted on what they called weird societies. And weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So these guys reviewed a comparative database from across the behavioral sciences, and what they found was that weird societies not only are not representative of humanity as a whole, they are in fact among the least representative populations one could find for generalizing about humans. By many measures, Americans are farther out on the bell curve than Europeans, so in other words, they're outliers among outliers. And interestingly, a lot of these outlying traits pertain to the type of education that we have come to think of as normal in weird societies. All social mammals have evolved species-specific behaviors for learning and transmitting the skills that they're going to need to survive as adults. And our own species evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in small, mixed-age communities where children are embedded in adult activity. They're surrounded by older and younger children, young adults, grandparents. They're immersed in the natural world. They are free to play, move, exercise their bodies. They're free to follow their curiosity, to explore, to experiment, to tinker. And they're able to observe, imitate, and then participate in adult work as they become developmentally ready. A Baiga father in the forests of India knows that if a child tries something and then backs away, you leave him alone. He'll be back to try again later. A Yupik elder knows that young children learn better from story than from lecture, from real-life experience than from verbal instruction. A foray parent from Papua New Guinea knows that children learn a lot of things much better by emulating older children rather than being taught by adults. And a Maori mother knows that children don't develop in a straight upward progression, but in a kind of stair-step pattern with long plateaus followed by sudden leaps forward. So people all over the world know these things about children and learning, and a lot more than that. And interestingly, though, these approaches are as workable for learning how to conduct a scientific experiment or design software or write an elegant essay as they are for learning to hunt caribou or identify medicinal plants in a rainforest. If you talk to gifted scientists, artists, writers, entrepreneurs, you are going to very often find that they did most of their learning the way a Warani child in the Amazon learns, through experimentation, keen observation, immersion, freedom, the kind of, through real play and real work, through the kind of free activity where the distinction between work and play disappears. Talk to a really good auto mechanic, carpenter, farmer, fiddle player, web designer, photographer, chef. You're going to very often find that they learned the same way. So any wildlife biologist knows that an animal in a zoo will not develop normally if the environment is incompatible with the evolved species, the evolved social needs of its species. But we no longer know this about ourselves. We have radically altered our own evolved species behavior by artificially segregating children in same-age peer groups during the day, by expecting them to be indoors and sedentary for most of the day, by asking them to learn from artificial text-based materials instead of contextualized real-world activities, and by dictating arbitrary timetables for learning instead of following the unfolding of a child's developmental readiness. Common sense should tell us that all of this is going to have complicated and unpredictable results, and in fact, it does. While some children seem able to function in this completely artificial environment, really significant numbers of them cannot. And around the world, every day, millions and millions of normal, bright, healthy children are labeled as failures in ways that damage them for life. And increasingly, those who can't adapt to the artificial environment of school are diagnosed as brain disordered and drugged. It is in this context that our fearless leaders in the U.S. Education Department and other experts in positions of authority make really broad statements about how children learn and how best to teach them. But making generalizations about how children learn based on their behavior in school is like making generalizations about killer whales based on their behavior at SeaWorld. So one of the weirdest characteristics of education in our society, there are a lot of them, but one of the very weirdest, a lot of indigenous people from around the world will tell you, is that our approach to education is extraordinarily authoritarian. It is obsessed with compulsion and control. So the child in a modern classroom may not move, speak, sing, laugh, eat, drink, read, write, think her own thoughts, look out the window, or even use the toilet without explicit permission from an authority figure. The teacher has control over the child, the district and the state have control over the teacher. Increasingly, systems of national standards and funding are now creating control over the state. And in what should be considered a very chilling development, there are murmurings now of creating globalized standards for education, for the creation of a single global authority dictating what every child on the planet has to learn. So the problem with this scenario should be obvious. Who gets to decide what the world's children are going to learn? And just as important, who decides what they are not going to learn? Who decides they have to learn algebra but not permaculture? Who decides they have to know the periodic table but not the provisions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Because while your kids are very busy toiling over algebra and chemistry, international trade agreements are being forged and currencies are being manipulated by entities that most Americans do not even know the names of, much less the inner workings of. And while children in the developing world, the so-called developing world, are struggling with, English romantic poets and high school physics, the IMF and the World Bank are negotiating incentives for foreign investments that are resulting in their ancestral lands being sold out from under them to foreign timber mining companies, energy companies, and Wall Street speculators in agricultural land. So, in weird societies, we are so habituated to this appalling lack of personal freedom that it has become functionally invisible to us. And in a truly Orwellian twist, many people now consider it a fundamental human right to be legally compelled to learn what somebody in authority says they have to learn. But the idea of centrally controlled education is as problematic as the idea of a centrally controlled press, and for exactly the same reasons. So I think there's a crucial confusion in our society between the idea of publicly supported education and the idea of centrally controlled, state-administered education, which, as everyone in this room knows, increasingly means corporate-controlled education. So if you want to get your hands around this distinction, just replace the word school with the word radio, and I'll ask you two questions if you can have a show of hands. How many people in this room are in favor of publicly supported community radio? How many people in this room are in favor of centrally controlled, state-administered radio? So there's a big distinction between these two things, but we're so used to it that many of us can't really see the alternative. So I just want to suggest a little thought experiment. What if we took our existing local school and instead of trying to reform it from the top down through bureaucratic means, we simply removed the element of compulsion? What if we allowed our schools to operate the way human beings have structured their social learning relationships for 100,000 years, based in freedom, autonomy, consent and cooperation instead of in compulsion and control. So that means no compulsory attendance, no compulsory curriculum, no compulsory grading and testing. So what would happen if we just took that one piece out? Would all hell break loose? Well, I would suggest that at first, in most cases, if you removed the element of compulsion tomorrow, nothing very radical would happen. I used to do wildlife rescue and rehabilitation, and one of the things that we all knew is that once you had kept an animal in a confined condition for long enough, you can open the door and they won't go out. They're very tentative and fearful and of the unknown. So most people would probably just keep doing what they're doing. But slowly, a few things might start to happen. Couple teenagers might break away and create self-designed learning programs, or they might set up apprenticeships or volunteer work or paid work in the community. Maybe groups of kids would get together to make a documentary film or plant a garden. Maybe a little group of parents of the kids diagnosed with ADHD would say, look, okay, there has to be some way we can figure out to have our kids run around outside more during the day. Maybe somebody would organize a writing workshop or a photography workshop or a sustainability study group that could include both teenagers and adults from the community. Maybe writers or farmers or chefs from the community would come into the school and start to share their skills. So slowly the school starts to become permeable to the community. Adults start coming in, both as students and as mentors, and students start going out as apprentices and as participants in community activities. So instead of a compulsory state-administered institution where we segregate children from life, we slowly begin to evolve toward an open, publicly supported community learning center. The school becomes a gathering place for the whole community, a place for conversations, for collaboration, as Illich would have said, for conviviality, instead of for compulsion and control. So we suddenly realized, right here in our neighborhood, we have this really large building. Okay, it's usually a really ugly building, which is something that always bothers me, that we often are keeping our children in the ugliest building in town during the day. But it's still a really large building with lots of rooms. We have an auditorium where we can do plays and concerts and lectures. We have science labs. We have a woodworking shop. We have a gymnasium. We have art studios. We have a library. We could have science labs that go on all afternoon for the kids that really love science. We have our community garden. We could get goats. We could make goat cheese because we have this huge, industrial kitchen, and we could have cooking classes and big community dinners, and we could set up a student-run coffee shop so students could learn how to run a business while they're still teenagers. We could have a student-run gallery space where they sell, art and student-created art and woodworking. We could have a maker space. We could have a bike repair shop. So I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what about the Common Core standards? Somebody thinking that? Somebody worried about the Common... So the important thing to realize is that somebody in your community is going to be worried about the Common Core standards. Some people, no matter what great ideas you have, are going to continue to want a very conventional education for their kids, and if you try to take that away from them, you're going to start a war, and by the way, you will lose that war. So you have to envision a community learning center that is diverse. That means you may have one group of kids who are doing a full-time traditional academic program, you might have another group of kids doing an innovative learner-directed program, and you're going to have other kids that are out of the school and, apprenticing or unschooling in the community and just coming in for the filmmaking workshop or the permaculture class. So it's a big blind spot for progressives sometimes. I think the goal is not to gain control of the school and use it to control other people. The goal is to remove the institutional barriers to flexibility, change, adaptation, evolution, diversity, to turn the system from a dead mechanical structure into a living organism that can evolve and adapt to the diverse needs of children and communities.
It's such an honor to be part of a gathering in such a hip city as Portland. A gathering like this, it's so inspiring. Thank you so much for inviting me. In thinking about the so-called new activism, I can't help but consider, where do actions come from? Where do our words and our deeds and our very presence, where does it come from? So I'd like to propose that just as the scent of any plant comes from its own essential nature, its own essential oil, that's what gives it the fragrance, so it is with our own actions and our own words, at anything we offer. So it seems to me an intelligent way to proceed is to fine-tune the place from which we come, the essence, the essential nature of our being. And as it turns out, it's incredibly accessible. The deepest nature is incredibly accessible. We forget that, we overlook it. We get lost in a lot of hubbub and neurotic thought and fighting and fear. You know, you listen to the news, it's terrifying, right? And naturally fear arises. But there's a way to keep fine-tuning to this essential nature that is calm, that is quiet, that is moving in ease. And then the actions and the productions that come from that have certain qualities. You don't even have to try for them. They come as a package deal. And these qualities are incredibly effective in all of our activism. The first one I'll talk about is that of embodiment. Because when one is deeply quiet, deeply at ease in your own being, you will feel your own embodiment. It'll remind you that you're embedded in an ecosystem, on a planet, that you're an animal, and that the systems of moisture and of sunlight, all the things that grow your food and produce your water, it's all connected. You feel it all, in fact, intermingling in your own being. Embodiment is a very powerful recognition for clear activism, for clear action. Another one that comes readily is that of discernment. So when you're deeply quiet, when you're at ease, and by the way, this is just like tuning into a channel. It's like tuning into the channel. I like to call it the silent channel. Just dial it in. You can do that right now. When you're at ease, there's much more clear discernment. It's obvious, right? We all know this. Sometimes you know you're taking a shower and suddenly the resolution to something that's been kind of problematic shoots through like a comet through an open sky, right? A kind of clarity that's just there as you relax. Discernment. Another example I like to use is if you have a white canvas, and there are scribbles all over it, but in the midst of the scribbles is a beautiful calligraphy. You don't really notice the calligraphy because of the scribbles. It's just all a jumble. But if it's the same white canvas and the beautiful calligraphy stands out on the white canvas, you see it very clearly. You see every stroke of the brush. And it's the same as your own attention is clear, as it's relaxed. The clarity of your proposed action or of your idea, it pops. Another aspect that arises easily is that of generosity. And with it, I'm going to add another component, which is that of understanding. So it's not only generosity of things, but it's also a generosity of heart that sits in great understanding. So that perhaps when you are in negotiation with someone who let's say you're opposed to the plan, to the development plan, to the new mining plan, to the new fracking plan, and so on. Fair enough to be opposed, but to sit also in some form of understanding with your so-called opponent, because that will lead to a lot more conversation. And there's another aspect that comes with this, and that is the deeper one sits in that understanding, the less you demand being understood yourself. You speak your piece, but there's a letting go in your heart that knows that if you're constantly demanding that someone get you, and in fact they're not getting you, it's a constant frustration, and it's a cause for separation. So another component of understanding is understanding that people are wherever they are in their own evolutionary moment. And believe it or not, they're doing the best they can. Your quiet and your mercy in a situation like that often will or can have the possibility of opening a door to their heart. Just as you know this from being on the other side, when someone has shown you a bit of mercy, a bit of understanding, when you were completely screwed up in something, how softening that is. And related to all of that, in this quiet of being, is a great tenderness. A tenderness for life itself and for all of the loss that we all face and for all of the beauty that we all experience, the incredible, heartbreaking beauty, almost unbearable beauty, and for the connections and the love, incredible tenderness that comes and will inform your activism, however humble that may be, whatever your orbit is of your actions. That tenderness will inform every moment of it. Sitting in this ease of being, nothing to it, nothing extra. And lastly, I'll just say a few words about the quality of delight. That as you rest in that, tune into that channel, into that ease of being, into that simple presence, into that direct aliveness, you exude a lot more delight. And delight is very catchy. And it has a calming effect. It's always so inspiring for me to be with people who I know are seeing the picture and seeing the difficulties of the picture. And let's face it, we live in very difficult, challenging times. But it's always so inspiring, isn't it, when you're with someone who sees that and who has a twinkle in their eye, who is actually delighted still with life. And not in denial and not telling some big fairy tale, making it all okay, or that it's not all real or some crazy thing. But rather, they're looking right at it, and still they have a twinkle in their eye. It's incredibly inspiring. So give that gift to yourself, your family, and your friends. Sit in your own sweetness, in your own ease of being, in your own delight, and be tender and let your understanding flow. Be generous. And then your actions will have that fragrance of beauty. Thank you.
in every corner of the world, we are being pressured by a monoculture, a global consumer monoculture. It is being pushed by our governments who have a blind idea of growth and development.
The promise of development and progress is starting to crack. The issues facing us are connected to a common global economic system. All of our people are being squeezed every day by that. And all of our imaginations are being colonized by that system.
What we need is not scaling up of those solutions, but scaling out of those solutions, replication in millions of these variety of solutions, innovative solutions that are emerging. It's quite possible.
What we need to do is to actually create platforms in which these sorts of initiatives are able to get together, are able to synergize, are able to actually build those larger narratives, are able to begin to change the public discourse.
We're trying to create an alliance, an international alliance for localization, because we need a united no, one giant no to a continuation of that system. And at the same time, we need to see ourselves as actually part of an enormous movement involving hundreds of millions of people that are saying many yeses to diverse ecosystems, diverse cultures, diverse identities. This is about reclaiming our right to be who we are in our different ways of being. It's about reclaiming the diversity that is life.